Hey everybody, Mike Rossi here again with another of my video series, What Do You Want to Know? Actually, I've decided that I'm going to change the name of this to Making Sense of the World in 2024. This is kind of the title of last week's video, but it's basically what all of these little short discussions are, making sense of where we are today. And a number of you had told me in the comments that you would like to talk about the ongoing conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and more specifically, the fate of Nagorno Karabakh, right? This piece of territory within Azerbaijan that since the early to mid 1990s had been under the control of Armenian rebels, separatists, however way you want to call them, and for about 30 years had existed in some way, shape, or form as a parastate. Now, a parastate is a term that I want to methodically describe in this video. I have videos on parastates within my playlists, which you can certainly check out, but something that I definitely want to talk about today. Now, Azerbaijan has taken complete control over not just the specific region called Nagorno Karabakh, but also territory between Armenia itself and the Karabakh region, which collectively was named the Republic of Artsakh, right? So this might get a little complicated here. Like, what's the difference between Karabakh and Artsakh? Artsakh is all the territory that Armenians had controlled in western Azerbaijan for roughly 30 or so years, which included about 90 to 95% of Nagorno Karabakh, which was a pre-existing little entity within the Soviet Union that was part of Azerbaijan, but overwhelmingly populated by ethnic Armenians. So when the Soviet Union breaks up in 1991, Armenians find themselves minorities within a country not of their own choosing. And so this produces a regional conflict, a regional border clash between Armenia to the west and Azerbaijan to the east, in which Armenian rebels, separatists, seize control over much of Karabakh, as well as much of the adjoining territory, creating this larger entity that had been controlled, funded, defended, and supported by Armenia up until 2020. The first counteroffensive that succeeded by Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan had tried numerous times to retake the territory, but had failed most of the time. But the first successful counteroffensive took place in November of 2020, in which it had won back roughly between 60 to 75% of all of this territory. Armenia calls for a ceasefire, so does Russia. And then in September of last year, basically about one day from September the 19th to September the 20th, Azerbaijan, depending upon what side you're on, either resumes the counteroffensive or breaks the ceasefire, violates the ceasefire, threatens to take everything until the Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan calls for a permanent ceasefire, agrees to lay down, all support. In fact, Armenia doesn't even formally get itself involved in this conflict. It's basically Karabakh against the Azerbaijani army, which has been sustained and supported by Turkey over many, many years. So the agreement was to dissolve the entire Artsakh Republic on January 1st, 2024. This led to a mass exodus of Armenians living in the Karabakh Artsakh area, most of whom are now seeking living as refugees within Armenia itself. The final decision, the final agreement, the peace process has yet to convene between Armenia and Azerbaijan. It's unknown whether Russia will chair the meeting or whether the United States or the European Union will somehow take control, or whether it will just be an international joint effort. Right now, it's just sort of indefinitely postponed, which as far as Azerbaijan is concerned is more than happy because they control the territory, right? So for Azerbaijan, this is just, a series of decisive victories. Armenia has seen as, completely capitulated. There have been demonstrations, near riots in Yerevan and elsewhere, calling Prime Minister Pashinyan a traitor. Somebody who just threw Karabakh under the bus. It's, Armenian genocide part 2. But Pashinyan is still in power and has distanced himself, notably, from Russia, whom he blames as being the country largely responsible for abandoning Karabakh. To this, Armenia, or Pashinyan in specifics, has said that he intends to withdraw Armenia from the CTSO, that is the Collective Security Treaty Organization. It's kind of like a mini defense pact between maybe about half of post-Soviet countries, and forging closer ties with the US and the EU, without any other specific reason, which, of course, brings one to, wonder whether or not Armenia is destined to become the next Georgia, or the next Ukraine, for that matter. So this is kind of where we are in the present period. But, it's worth taking a step back and, looking at the developments that led to where we are. And, there's no shortage of videos on YouTube that talks about the Karabakh conflict, either from the Armenian or the Azerbaijani point of view. Both are absolutely replete with all kinds of nationalistic slogans and stuff. I want to give sort of a very concise and truncated, description of all of this. So, by no means is this video, completely exhaustive of all of the information. This is not military analysis. This is not specific explanations of different types of weaponry or other elements. It's sort of a broad-based way of trying to make sense of how it happened and why it happened. So the first thing I want to do is get to this term called parastate, because that is what the so-called Republic of Artsakh was, a parastate. And I define a parastate as a territorial entity that has in some way declared independence from, broken away from, an existing independent state, and claims that it is a country all of its own. But the difference between a normal sovereign state and a parastate is that parastates do this without any coordination from the host country, and are oftentimes seen as a violation of international law because a parastate violates the territorial integrity, the sovereignty of an existing country. So a parastate is a territory that possesses declarative sovereignty, right? And this is basically the old school way of understanding what sovereignty is, right? You kind of plant a flag in the ground, you declare the land yours, you're able to somehow defend it, and just by that alone, right, congratulations, the country is yours. Declarative sovereignty follows 4 basic principles from the 1933 Montevideo Convention, in which a state exists if it possesses 4 things. Number 1, a permanent population. Number 2, a defined territory. Number 3, a defined government. And number 4, the capacity to enter into relations with other states. Right? So in this sense, right, parastates basically exist like any other country. And some parastates, like Northern Cyprus, Kosovo for that matter, are relatively stable, and in some cases even more secure than some sovereign countries, like the Democratic Republic of Congo or Somalia or Central African Republic for that matter. But the thing that keeps parastates from being seen as official sovereign countries, even though some countries want them to be so, is that they do not and cannot get membership in the United Nations. This is the big thing. If you have UN membership, you are considered a full, sovereign, internationally recognized state. Yes, there are some UN states that are not completely recognized. Like there are some countries that don't recognize the state of Israel, but yet Israel is in the UN. So if you have UN membership, and there are 193 UN member states right now, the last one to get in was South Sudan. Interestingly enough, South Sudan breaks away from the rest of Sudan in 2011. But it's done by a referendum that is agreed upon by the Sudanese government in Khartoum. So if the referendum passed a certain threshold, voting yes for independence, the government in Khartoum would honor this agreement and recognize South Sudan as a country. This is the reason why the referendum in South Sudan took basically a month to go from referendum to UN membership. By no means is South Sudan a prosperous country. It basically is bordering on failed state status, but it's in the UN. Karabakh is not. Neither is Kosovo. So this is an extra layer of sovereignty that in the literature is known as constitutive sovereignty, in which case you can take the 4 steps of the Montevideo Convention, which I'll repeat again: a permanent population, a defined territory, a defined government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. You should add a 5th, which makes it all the more official, and that is that this entity, that this territory is formally and legally recognized as such by international bodies like the UN. No one opposes South Sudan's independence because the host state agreed to it. Right? That's the whole thing. Serbia opposes Kosovo's independence. Cyprus opposes Northern Cyprus's independence. Georgia opposes Abkhazia, South Ossetia's independence. Interestingly enough, we also can have special types of parastates like Palestine and Taiwan. They're not breakaway entities. They're what we would call non-recognized states, in which China blocks any attempt at Taiwan's further sovereign integration, and Israel, through the United States, will do the same thing with Palestine. Okay, I'm sort of getting, sidetracked here, but I just want you to get the sense of this is what Artsakh was for about 30 years. It was a parastate, which was formally supported by Armenia, not formally recognized, and tacitly it was supported by Russia, even though Russia acknowledged the original 1991 borders of all post-Soviet countries, including Azerbaijan. Okay, so that's the basic definitions, backgrounds of parastates. Let's now focus on Artsakh itself. Since 1994, there had been a series of protocols, colloquially called the Bishkek Protocols, that had been signed and monitored by Armenia, by Azerbaijan, by Russia, by the United States, and by France, which officially calls for a ceasefire, a cessation of conflict, and the beginning processes of negotiated settlements over what to do with Karabakh, and by extension the territory outside of Karabakh, but within Azerbaijan that Armenians had controlled. The Bishkek Protocols were little more than benchmarks. They had never really been implemented. Azerbaijan had, as a host state, really felt no need to sign on to this, because the minute that they do, it somehow implicitly recognizes the loss of this territory, with the possibility of some exchange of territory or something like that. So Azerbaijan continues to believe, with some credibility, that most of the international supporters of this were pro-Armenian, that had Armenian sympathies, right? This is the 1990s, so Azerbaijan is not as important economically as it is. It has really one major ally in the region, and that's Turkey. And Turkey ends up becoming the real deal maker down the road. Karabakh remains effectively a frozen conflict for at least another 15 or so years. It is in the fall of 2020 that suddenly Azerbaijan makes another attempt at trying to seize control over the larger Artsakh region. But this time, It has military, logistical, diplomatic, and economic support from Turkey. In addition, Erdogan sends Azerbaijan up to 2,000 mercenaries on Turkey's payroll from Syria. You can call them mercenaries, you can call them terrorists, you can call them whatever it is you want to call them, but they were effectively the shock troops that went into the conflict first. To that, Armenia does not formally respond. Armenia itself does not mobilize, knowing that if they do, they could risk getting into a larger conflict, not just with Azerbaijan, but also with Turkey itself. So the region's dynamics have changed since the 1990s. And throughout much of September through October and November, reports were scant coming out of, who was controlling what. Armenian press made it look like the Azerbaijani forces were determined, but were just getting slaughtered left and right. And no one really knows how many people died in this conflict. But suddenly, around November, there was a major breakthrough in the Armenian Artsakh defense lines. And Azerbaijan had begun taking back territory within Artsakh's southern and southeastern regions. Now, most of these areas outside of the Karabakh area itself were sparsely populated. These were populated mostly by ethnic Azerbaijanis who had fled in the early 1990s, and the area was, by and large, no man's land. It was largely deserted. But once Azerbaijani forces started making inroads into core territories within Karabakh, the tide began to change. And with the capture of the second largest city in Karabakh, the city of Shushi, this is when both Armenia and Karabakh had called for a ceasefire. It was primarily Armenia because they realized that if they didn't, the rest of Karabakh risked being taken. Shushi offers strategic advantage points over the city, the capital of Stepanakert. So by calling for a ceasefire, getting Russia involved in all of this, right, the idea was to preserve what was left, to lay down arms, and to begin peace negotiations. Now, at this point, any talk of all of Artsakh becoming an independent entity, out the window. Any talk of adhering to the Bishkek protocols of 1994, outdated. Baku now has the decisive advantage. So for them, agreeing to a ceasefire was largely, I would say, under pressure, right, from Russia, with the idea that, secure what you can now and see what happens down the road. It's the same thing from the Armenian side. The Armenians see this not as a defeat, but also a victory for nobody. Azerbaijan is like, no, this is an absolute capitulation. Whatever is left of Karabakh is now going to be completely isolated because the agreements within the 2020 ceasefire is that gradually over the next few months, Armenia would cede territory of Artsakh that had not yet been captured by Azerbaijani forces outside of the Nagorno Karabakh borders. You following me on this? So those areas of the, those areas that kind of connected Armenia itself to Karabakh would be ceded back to Azerbaijan. The Azerbaijani army would take full control over these territories between November and December. There would be one corridor, one little pass that connected Armenia proper to the rest of Karabakh. This was known as the Lachin Corridor. The agreement, the ceasefire agreement, was that Russian peacekeepers would control the corridor and also assume full security over what remained of Karabakh. And this would allow both sides an opportunity to prepare positions for an eventual negotiated solution to the whole conflict, right? And this is kind of what this is what we left Karabakh in for roughly 1.5 to 2 years, right? So this is the end of 2020, beginning of 2021, and it kind of remains as such until early 2023. In March of 2023, this is an interesting development here. All of a sudden, Nikol Pashinyan states that Armenia as a country is ready to recognize that Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan. So this all of a sudden, for the first time, right, is an official statement by the biggest thing that Artsakh had to a host country, right, a sponsoring country, Armenia, saying that they are willing to give up, right, any claims to the territory. And through the 1991 Almaty Declaration, all of this territory is part of Azerbaijan's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Now, here's where things get a little chaotic, because as far as Russia's concerned, and Putin and more specifically Lavrov have gone on record to say that this statement took them by surprise, because they didn't think that this was going to be such a sudden acknowledgement. They were ready to push for Azerbaijan's territorial integrity, but all of a sudden Pashinyan's statement kind of throws whatever is left of Karabakh under the proverbial bus, to which by this point Azerbaijan realizes, well, then there's no need for Russian peacekeeping soldiers. If Armenia recognizes that all of this is within our territory, then we, as the sovereign owners of this territory, need to control it, including the Lachin corridor. So Azerbaijani forces begin taking control over this little lifeline, this little corridor between Armenia and Karabakh. And tensions flare again between remnants of Karabakh's forces and sympathizers within Armenia. Russia is, at least according to them, playing it by the legal books, saying that their presence in the region, there's only 2,000 Russian peacekeeping troops. So we're not talking, Wagner PMC. We're not talking about major army here. We're simply talking about people that are trying to enforce the peace, keep the ceasefire from deteriorating. And all of a sudden, at least the official narrative from Azerbaijan and even Russia is that militants from Karabakh tried to escalate conflict again, to which Azerbaijan responds by threatening to take over the whole thing. And the ceasefire is broken on September the 19th, 2023, in 1 to 2 days, I think 2 days tops. Another ceasefire is declared. Armenia itself pressures the remnants of the Karabakh government to lay down their weapons and effectively end the war. And that's basically it. A ceasefire took place on September the 20th, 2023, which resulted in a complete capitulation of whatever was left of Nagorno Karabakh, Artsakh, whatever you want to call it at that point, with the agreement that on January 1st, 2024, the government of Artsakh dissolves and Azerbaijani forces move into Stepanakert. Now, within this time, there was a mass exodus of Armenian civilians from the region into Armenia itself. Azerbaijan clearly saw this as a major point for bragging and took multiple victory laps, both in Baku as well as in Stepanakert. Officials from Artsakh have been arrested, regarded as terrorists, regarded as separatists, and a host country effectively using the military to take control over disputed territory, while risky, has proven to be one of the surefire solutions to ending a frozen conflict. Within the larger context of how do we deal with parastates, whether it's Kosovo or Palestine or Karabakh or Abkhazia, you have negotiated approaches, but oftentimes these lead nowhere because the breakaway entity wants, everything but reintegration into the country it broke away from. And the host country wants everything but giving this group independence. So you've got two sides that are diametrically opposed, and each side likes to stall or blackmail or just simply wait for a more opportune moment. And, if all else fails, use the military. And this is what Georgia tried to do with Abkhazia and South Ossetia in July, I think, of 2008. And then the Russian army intervenes, pushes the Georgian army out, and 1 month later, in August of 2008, recognizes the independence of both of these breakaway entities. So using the military can be risky, because if you don't succeed, you end up giving more credibility to the breakaway region for independence. Azerbaijan has tried repeatedly since the 90s to retake the territory and has largely failed. So this time around, the initial response on the Armenian side is, all right, here we go again. But this time, Azerbaijan was much more equipped. The country is now emerging as a much more important country. One would even say Russia, began to realize that Azerbaijan is more important to keep on their side than Armenia. And, of course, is the other idea that Pashinyan is really no friend of Russia. Came to power a couple of years ago with the intention of moving the country more towards the West, right? In the same way that Moldova, Ukraine, even Georgia is doing. There's certainly factions within Russia, like there are in Georgia and Moldova. Some are pro-Russian, others are pro-American. It's not smoking gun evidence, but there is enough to hypothesize that Russia may have even allowed Azerbaijan, or just not intervened in a certain way to give Azerbaijan the ability to really put the squeeze on Armenia to come to an agreement, but to, move them back into Russia's sphere of influence. As far as Russia's concerned, this is now an internal matter to be discussed with, Armenia and Azerbaijan. Russia's position within this ceasefire situation is done. They seem that they had done their job. And, with that said, it leads us to wondering what the ultimate peace agreements are going to be. Officially, the government of Azerbaijan has said, at least officially, that the rights of the Armenian community would be protected, would be certainly honored by various, existing international agreements. But official statements are one thing, actual actions are something else, right? Especially when victory parades are held that display, huge elements of Azerbaijani nationalism. Streets in Stepanakert are named after the architects of the Armenian genocide a century earlier. You have to remember, Azerbaijan and Turkey are close allies. Designs on southern Armenian territory to create a corridor between Azerbaijan and Nakhchivan give Armenia, and really anybody in the government in Yerevan, not just Pashinyan, right, certainly doubt that working with Azerbaijan is going to produce anything. And, look, when you finally expel the population, they don't really come back. The population has already left. If the population was still in Karabakh, and we're talking at least 90% has left, then we could certainly talk about autonomy and minority rights, especially under the umbrella of, Russia and the EU. But try to get Russia, the EU, and the US to work together on all of this right now. So I don't know. It has been now more than 4 months since Artsakh's dissolution. No one has been talking about a final sit-down agreement, peace terms between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Will the Armenians return? Do they have guaranteed security? Will there be international peacekeeping soldiers there to protect them? Will the original Soviet Oblast of Karabakh be reinstated? Because this was ultimately one of the positions that Russia was advocating. And that was, okay, Armenia, you've got control over all of this other territory outside of Karabakh. You can use that as a bargaining chip with Azerbaijan by saying, okay, in return for either the direct access to Karabakh through the Lachin corridor, or if nothing else, the executive autonomy of this region, sort of the Kurdistanification of Karabakh, will give you all of this territory back. Okay, the Azerbaijanis that had been displaced will allow them to full return, compensation, this, that, the other thing. And up to that point, Armenian leaders, including Pashinyan, prior to March of 2023, had said, no, we will fight. We will fight. We will resist. Even after the 2020 ceasefire, in which Karabakh, Artsakh really, loses 75% of its territory by either being fully captured by Azerbaijan or will have to give back to Azerbaijan, the position was, no, we will fight, we'll fight, we'll fight, we'll fight. Okay, you fought, you lost, now what? You have no bargaining chips anymore. So does that mean that this area is now completely referred to, in the past tense? It's something that was discussed when it happened, but it got buried within international media. I think attention was certainly more on Ukraine at that time. This is especially true when we're talking about late 2023, 2024. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict flared up. So what was happening in far-off, middle-of-nowhere Karabakh was largely lost to an audience outside of Armenian and Azerbaijani circles. So it's why is it important, right? Why is discussing it important? Well, in the end of the day, it is ethnic cleansing. It is the loss of territory that regardless of what side you're on. If you're on Armenia's side, you see it as effectively the loss of cities, towns, civilizations that had lived there for centuries and had enjoyed some form of quasi-independent autonomy for over 30 years. If you're on Azerbaijan's side, the sovereign country takes control over what is rightfully theirs. And if the population doesn't want to live in this land, well, go someplace else. It wouldn't be the first time that a population was displaced by a host country taking control of land back again. Some have gone back, but once you're gone, once that link is broken, very few people do go back. And I think that this is Azerbaijan's secret hope, is that by stalling for an eventual resolution to the whole Karabakh issue, the vast majority of displaced Armenians will not go back. In that sense, you don't have to worry about a minority. You don't have to worry about power sharing. And, the region, widely deserted, can be major construction projects for Azerbaijani and, more importantly, Turkish companies, right? Azerbaijan is deeply in debt to Turkey for all of this. And I have absolutely no doubt that Turkey is going to want to capitalize on its investments by sort of Turkifying, de-Armenianizing this entire region. So things that we think happened last century, whether it's the 90s or the 40s or whenever, are still happening today. And, if nothing else, when we talk about frozen conflicts and parastates, we have to acknowledge that one solution among many, it's not the best solution, but if you have a powerful enough army and the breakaway region does not have a deterrence, use the military. And if you can take back the territory, no parastate, no people, no problem. So that is what I hope is a quick encapsulated synopsis of the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict surrounding Nagorno Karabakh. And, what else would you like to talk about next week? Let me know in the comments about this video, about what you think. If there was something that I missed, I'm certainly happy to address it. If there's something that you feel needs to be emphasized, by all means, put that in the comments section as well. You can also email me. at Mike Rossi, polysci at gmail.com. And I'll spend the next week or so trying to decide what topic to discuss next week. So thanks all for listening, and have a great week.